All right, so let's continue. So far, this is what we've got. We have this couple of inputs all the way down on this page right here. I am going to move that up and basically just starting maybe from this smaller and everything, including the picture, I'm gonna just put that below so that I don't have to scroll down all the time. So let's go back to this HTML. I'm gonna take from here through there. That's my stuff with the image. I'll cut it. Command X or Control X should get it cut from there. And then I'll move it below this whole section, going all the way down here. So I'll paste it down here. If I save, go back and reload my form, that should now put these things above. So that will be easy to work with. So a couple of things I'm gonna do before we move on talking about other input elements is first defining the document type. So very often when you look at HTML pages all the way on top in HTML, before the first HTML tag, you will usually see something like this. It will be like doc type, something like that. So basically this is a declaration. This one, if you see this is not actually an HTML tag. What this is a declaration of what HTML version you're planning to use going forward on this HTML page. So if you see doc type HTML, that's the simplified declaration that basically you are using HTML5. So what this basically does, it helps your browser to know what version of HTML you have below, and it's gonna render that using whatever declaration you have here. If you don't do that declaration, it will just automatically try to detect the version, and usually it will do, I guess, a pretty good job. A couple of other things I'm gonna do here. First, regarding this input elements, see we have this your name and your email, and that basically gives us this boxes, your name, your email. So sometimes you may have like a helper text in the box to explain what do you expect that person to enter in that box. So you can do that by using placeholder attribute. So this is that input box, the first one for the name. And if I go here and add a placeholder attribute, I can set a value. I'm gonna close this on the left so you can see this whole thing. I'm gonna say enter your name, something like this. So basically some text that goes as a value for that placeholder. And what's gonna happen if I go and take a look here, see it's basically gonna have enter your name in the box, but that's not actually text that's typed in the box. It's basically just a suggestion what you should be doing here. And as soon as I go here and start typing, see it will disappear. And if I clear the box, it will appear back to basically tell the user what to do in that box. So it's kind of like a helper text. All right, so let's add a select box. So select box is basically like a drop down to choose multiple options. So the way you create a drop down, I'll just do another div here to have this separate. And in this div, we'll do a drop down. So to do a drop down, you have to use select, and it's gonna be a container. And I'm gonna get rid of this for now. So we have just select opening, closing. That's the main container for the drop down. And that's just gonna create the drop down. So if I save this right now, reload this, see there is a drop down. There's nothing in it, but the drop down is already there. So to make actually options available in the dropdown, inside of that select container, you have to add option containers. And usually we would have a value, but for this particular demonstration, I'm gonna remove that and just add some text between that opening and closing of this option container. So I'm gonna say option A, so that will be the first option. And then I'll just copy paste this a couple of times and do option B and option C. So each option in this dropdown is going to be another option container within that select container. If I save this, go back and reload, we should see we have this drop down with those options, option A, option B, option C. Let's also add a radio button to this. So radio buttons work in a little different way than drop downs. So radio buttons are actually also input type elements. So the type is going to be, instead of text, radio. That's going to create a radio button. And if I just save this and go back and reload, you'll see that we have this little, see the circle with a dot. So that's our radio button. And you could have multiple radio buttons like this. So if I save this and go back and reload, now we should have 3 of those. And you can see how I can check all of those 3 together. So usually the behavior you would expect from a radio buttons is to have just something that you can only choose one option instead of being able to check all 3. So to make sure you have your radio buttons grouped together as one, what you have to do, you have to add a name attribute to your radio buttons, and they have to be using the same name. So if I use a name like answer, or really any name, and then apply that same name attribute to all of these other radio buttons, all of them having the same name is grouping these 3 radio buttons together. Now, if I have another radio button, for example, and this one has answer 2 as the name, this is not going to be grouped with this first 3. So let's see what happens when we do this. If I save this, go back and reload, we should have 4 radio buttons. See, the first 3 should be grouped together. So if I click on the first one, that checks the box. If I click on the second one, that will uncheck the first box, then go to the second one. Third one will uncheck the second box. These first 3 are grouped together, so it works like this. Now this fourth one is a different name. So if I click on it, it will be separate. So I can check that one separately from this first group. Getting back to this, I'm going to remove that one actually. You can also sometimes have what we call a checkbox. So that's also an input type element. So the type will not be text, it would be checkbox. So again, if I save this, go back and reload. So I'll probably have to zoom in a little bit. So see, there's this little checkbox here. That's what checkboxes do. Now you can see how this is kind of confusing when you have these checkboxes by themselves and radio buttons by themselves. So you probably need a label to tell what these things actually are, which you will do. And labels you can do either before, or sometimes you'll see people actually putting the input inside of the label. So both are possible. So if I go here and do a label for this checkbox, I'm going to remove the for part for now, and I'm going to say, do you agree? Let's say this is some terms of service. They have to check the box. Save this, go back, reload. So now we're going to have this do you agree text, and then there is this checkbox. So similarly, if you want a label for your radio buttons, same thing you could do for those. So if I go here, add a label, that will be, well, whatever this is, I guess, supposed to be, radio group. That's what I'm going to call this. Save this, go back, reload. That's going to put that radio group in here. Now we have these 3 options. Now when you do a radio group, you're probably going to have each option have its own meaning, what it's going to do. So for example, if this was like a survey question, you would have different answers for each. So you could do that by adding a label for each one of these. So I'm just going to do this, something like that, and change this first label to yes, the second label to no, and the third label to maybe. And then separately from this entire thing, you would probably have the actual question that you're asking the users. So to simplify this, I'll just do a heading. Are you joining us? So something like this. If I save this, go back and reload, we have this "Are you joining us?" header on top, then yes, no, maybe kind of options to check each one of these. So right now my labels are completely separate from my radio buttons. So right now if I click on this little circle, see, that checks the maybe, but if I click on this no, yes, like that part, nothing really happens. So that's because right now the actual click box for the radio button is disconnected from the label. We could attach them together by going here, and for our label we can create a for attribute and then give it something. So to know what that's for, we have to give to the input box some sort of ID. So if I go to this input box and give it an ID, I say the ID for this is yes. Then I can say this label is for that ID yes. So now this will attach this label to this input box. So the same way I can go here and do for no, and then go to the actual input box and do an ID no, and that should also attach this label to this no. So right now if I save this, go back and reload, what's going to happen is that if I click on this no, see, it checks the radio box as well because it's the label attached to that no. If I click on this maybe, nothing happens because I didn't do that for maybe. But if I click on this yes, that should check the box for yes, and no, check the box for no, and maybe is not going to do anything. So this is usually kind of a better experience for the user when you do this type of stuff. And sometimes, see, right now, if I go and just click right in the middle of that circle itself and the no, it's still not going to check the box. I have to either click directly on this circle or I have to click on the yes and no text. Another way to do this is put the input box inside of the label itself. So what I could do, I can just go here, see, before this label closing, I can just move this input to go inside of that label like this. So now it's gonna be in that label. So right now if I save this, this is just done for yes, for no, we didn't do that. If I go and refresh this, see if I have like maybe checked in. If I go here and click in the middle here, yes or no, it's still gonna check it because now I'm kind of just putting this whole thing together because I have that in a container together. And here in no, it's still not going to do it because no is just either here or click on the label. With yes, now pretty much anywhere in this area we click from here all the way through the left, it's still going to check that radio button. So these are some common boxes to get user input. Now let's see how we work with this in JavaScript land. So if I open my console, right click, inspect, go to my console. Now I can use JavaScript, hopefully to be able to get inside of this thing. So what you might need to do sometimes with JavaScript is get the value that's typed in the box. So if somebody were to go in and type something with JavaScript, how do I find this text? So to do that, we have to first find that input element itself. So that input element for me, if I scroll up, that's, see this one, and it has an ID yn. So I can go and find that element by using that ID. So I'm gonna do document dot get element by ID, and the ID for that is yn. And that right now, if I test it, see, it returns that input element. Now, if I want to see what's inside of that input element, which means what's typed in that element, then I'm going to do dot value for this. And that should just return the text that's inside of this box right here. If we wanted to get the value of this email, we should be able to just go and find that email input, which is this one, which, see, there are no IDs to search and find this. So we could find it in a different way, I guess. We could just find the input that's inside of this class cat. So we could do that. Not something I would probably suggest to do, but just because we're learning, that's probably a good idea to just do that by using get, actually it's query selector. And the selector we're going to run, we're going to do the cat class. And within that, we need the input box. See, it gets that, well, actually that gets enter your name. Oh, that's because this one is also in a cat class. All right, so that makes sense. So both of them are in that class cat. So we have to find a different way to find this input element. So what I'm going to do again, I'm going to go back here. Let me just clear this so I can start over. So I'm going to do selector all, and this will get me all of those. So right now, if I open this, see, we have a node list and we have 1 and 2 of them because we found the first one and the second one. And the second one is the email, which is, the position 1. So if we do 1, then we're going to get to that email. So that line, this will get us that input box. Now inside of that input box, we're going to get the value, which should right now be an empty string. There it is, an empty string, and those quotations that indicates the string here. So we get an empty string out of that. Now we can also set the value by taking that and making it equal to whatever value we want to set it to. So we can say me@me.com. So if I do this, press enter, see, we put that text as the value inside of that box programmatically using JavaScript in this case. So now if I go back and just get what's the value, because we already have that value in there, it's just going to give us the email that's in that box. And if we wanted to maybe just get rid of what's in there, we could set it to an empty text, and that would just clear what's in that input element right now. So now let's try to get what's selected in here. Option A, option B, option C, right? So that's select box. So when you create select boxes and you give options, each option should have the value. This is just the text for the users so they know what to check. But each option should have a value attached to it so you can actually retrieve which one you want. So the way that would look like, you would have this value, and this will be, doesn't have to match what's in here. So it's just going to be some values you're assigning for each one of those. Value A and value B. And it could be more than a single letter. So let me do something like this. Maybe this should be C. Anyways, so now we have these values. So now let's go get this. So to simplify this, let's add an ID to this. We're going to call it Dropdown, just a name. So now we can find that using that ID. So if I go back here, reload this because we need to get a refresh for our HTML, and I'm going to do document dot get element by ID, and the ID is going to be drop down. Just to test this, let's just run this line. There it is. We found that select box. Now, if I open that select box here, you'll see we have this option, 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 all those options. And then there are all these other things going down. So these are all properties and methods associated with that element. And if we keep scrolling down here, see, one of the properties is value, and that's A1. The value that's currently selected, that's option A, and option A value is A1 right here. So right now, if we just simply just do that same thing, dot value, it will give us the A1, which is the value of what's selected. If I go and change this to C and basically just run that same thing, it's going to give me C4 because that's the option that's selected now. So we get different values depending on what's selected, but the value again is not what's in here, what's for the user. You can see it's this value property that's attached to the option. Now for that same element, see, we have this options, and if I open that options, inside of that we have this selected index, which says 2. So it's 2 because 0, 1, 2. Right now, selected one is option C, which is selected index is 2. So if I just do this again, options dot selected index, and I believe it was uppercase I, it should give me 2. That's the one that's selected. So 0, 1, 2, the third one. So if I switch this to A, that should give us selected index is 0 because now we have the first one selected. So we should be able to also set our selected index. So I can say selected index, let's make it equal to 1. So right now, see, it says option A. If I run this, it went to option B because I changed the selected index to the second one. So 0, 1 is the second one. So that gives us the second selection. So we can modify which option is selected as well. Or we can also just get the value that's selected from that dropdown by doing .value. So that's that. Let's move on to this checkbox that says, do you agree? So let me just go and assign some sort of ID to this checkbox. I'm going to say ID and terms. Save that. Go back and reload. Let's try to communicate with this in JavaScript again. So again, I do document dot get element by ID, and the ID is terms, lowercase. Let's type that right. And if I do this, I should be able to find that input box. So let's see what's in it. So if I open this, so that gives me what attributes we have here. And if we look here, see there's this attribute checked. So I can use that in my advantage. So if I, again, search and find that element and do checked, that was the name of the attribute, it's going to say true because right now that box is checked. So if I uncheck this box and go back to my console and run that same code, it's going to say false because that's not checked. You can also, I believe, get the value of that by doing this, and value, see it says on apparently, and if I check it, does it say on again? Yeah, so that's, I guess, useless for us. So we can do checked, and that will say true and false. That way we'll know if the box is checked or it's not checked. Good, so that gives us this. Let's also now communicate with this radio button, finally. So if I go, oh, by the way, before I move on to this, we can also just programmatically change whether it's checked or not, right? So if we do right now checked, hit enter, it says true because it's checked. Now I can say that it should be false instead of being true. So if I run this, see, it will uncheck the box because we set that to false. And the same way I can make it true, and that will programmatically actually check that box. There is that. Let's move to radio button, like I said. So radio buttons, we have this radio buttons that are all, well, that's not that. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. So that's our radio buttons. So we have this input, input, input. These are all, again, connected together because we have the same name answer for all of these radio buttons. So because these are a group of buttons, we could go to each individual button and see what's going on. So we could just attach an ID to this first input and go and find that particular individual radio button, right? By the way, have the ID already? Yes. But I'm not going to do that because with radio buttons, it's more like a group of things that works together, and you group them together by using the same name. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go and find this radio button set by looking for that answer name. So let's go back here and do document dot get element by name. So the name was answer. And if I do that, I will get that list of radio buttons. See, we have 0, 1, 2. That's our list here. And the length is 3. And then if I open the first one, that's the first answer. And we can see whether that's checked or not. See, it says checked true for the first one. And then if I go for the second one, it's going to say checked false. And then the third one is going to be checked false too, because the first one is the checked item out of that list. And the total length is 3 because we have 3 items in that list. So I could switch that to check the no answer by doing this, and see the second one, the no, is the item number 1 in this list. So we'll do 1, and then we'll do checked equals to true. And see, now I switched that to no option because I made the second option checked. And then we could do like 2, we'll make it check the third option. So we can still communicate with those and say which one we want to check, which one we don't want to check. We can also run through these different items that we found in this list and check which one out of those is checked. So when you do this radio buttons, similar to Dropdowns, you will also assign a value to each option selected to know which one to get depending on what user selected. So let's go and assign some values to those radio buttons. So I'm going to go to this first one and assign value Y. So now I want to get the value of the radio button checked, right? So if I run this, so one way to do this, you could just go get it by name. And then when you found it by name, you could just loop through those and find, see here, if I do this again, we could just loop through these and find which one is checked. Whichever one is checked, we would get the value for that one. So that's one way of doing this, but I should be able to do more like CSS like search to find this by using my query selectors. To do that, I'm gonna just search for an input element that has the attribute name equal to answer. Now, this is gonna be kind of weird because see, this is like double quotes interfering with double quotes in our JavaScript. So for that reason, I'm going to use single quotations around this for my string, so I can have my double quotes inside working. So if I run that, see, it gets me the first one because I'm using query selector. It just gives me the first one out of all of those. If I do selector all, I'm going to get all of them. So just to show you, if I do query selector all, it gives me all 3 of those because I was able to find all input elements with the name answer. So that's good, but how do we get the one that is checked? So I'm going to go to selector because I just want one, and I can do this colon and do checked. And if I run this, see, I'm getting maybe because that's the one that's currently checked. If I do yes and go back and rerun this thing, that's going to get me the first one because that's what's checked. And if I finally press no, you see where this is going. It's going to get us no. So this is the way we can find the radio button that's checked. And now that we found it, we can just get the value of that. And that's n because we pressed no. If I do maybe option, if I run the same code, we're going to get maybe because that's what the value is for that maybe radio button. And that's that. So basically we can get the value for all of these input boxes. And you can see how the value for most of these, it's not like when I have this input boxes, they're not really containers. This is just a tag, and we're getting the value of the input of the person in there. Now, if you do have a container, see, for example, we have this h1, it's a container, has an opening and closing, and we might want to get the text in that container, right? So what we do document, and whatever that ID was, I have to go back and check, title apparently, so that's the ID, so title, and that will find that h1, as you can see. Now if I wanted to get the text that's in here, that's gonna be text content of that element. So if I do dot text content, C uppercase, see, it's gonna get me the text that inside of that h1. So if I scroll up, it says some text here, which is exactly what we get in here. And I can change that again by setting it to something. So see, the container can have text content because it has opening, it has closing, so there's text content. There will not be text content for like an input box because input box doesn't have opening and closing. So I'm gonna change this other text, and right now you can see how here it changed to other text. So I'm setting that to this. In addition to that, see, for example, if I get this main box div, now that includes bunch of things in it, right? It includes all of these different elements in there. Let's go and find this main box so you can see what's going on there. So if I do this and remove all of that, I'm gonna find that main box, and that will find that main box with everything that goes inside of it. So that's there. Now let's try to see what's the text content of that. So if I do text content, so what this is gonna give me, see, it's pretty much all the text inside of that with no HTML tags. So basically we're gonna get like this, then this, then this, then this, then this, this. So all this text content is just gonna come up. Well, not this one because it's outside of it, but anything that's inside of this div, at least, it's gonna come up because that's the text content in there. Now, if you wanted to get the entire thing, including all the HTML tags and everything else, you can do that by using inner HTML. Not this, but inner, like that. So see, that will give us the whole thing, including the HTML in the box. So it gives us this escape things, so to explain us that this is really quotation, not this quotation for our string. But other than that, that's the text together with HTML. So inner HTML, it's gonna be that whole content inside of that element. And you could change that too, similar to how you can change everything else. So this is basically that inner HTML for this element. So if I wanted to change all of these to something else, I could just set it to something else in my JavaScript code by simply finding that box and setting the inner HTML to some new HTML. So I can change that to h2 tag, and this is basically gonna be our HTML as string going right here. So new HTML, so that's gonna be the text. So if I do this and run this code, you'll see it's gonna replace all of this stuff that used to be inside of that main box div to that HTML. So if I go back right now and check with my inspector, see in that main box, there's just this one h2 that says new HTML, and that's it. So we can also get and set the HTML. Now again, this is gonna be for our container elements. So we're getting the inner HTML of our container, or inner text of our container. And that brings me to another tag that you will see in HTML forms that can create confusion sometimes with all of these rules we have. So for example, I'm gonna go here below this checkbox, do you agree? Let's just do a div to do some sort of separation, and then I'm going to use text area. So text area is a container. You could do this columns and rows, but I'm not going to do it for now. I'll just keep it simple. Text area, something like this. So text area is a container. Unlike all of these other, like this input, this is just text area. It's a container. And what it is, it's basically just a box where you can type stuff. But now you can write multiple lines of content. So for input boxes, the regular ones, you can only write a single line in here. In text area, you can do a larger paragraph sort of like text with new lines and all this stuff. So that's the text area. And if you wanted to get the actual content that inside of that area, the value, so that text area, as you can see, it's a container, right? So let's actually just do an ID for this. I'm going to call it area. Let's go back and reload this. So now I have some text in here, which I did type before, which my browser auto-filled for me. Now let's go and find that text area. So I'm going to do document.getElementById, and the ID of that text area is going to be area. That's what I typed. And if I do this, I'm going to find that text area. So that's good. So if I wanted to get the actual text in that box, so I can do that by using value, similar to how I would do it for like input boxes. So that's kind of a little weird in a way, because it's still something you're typing in a box and you get the value, but for whatever reason, it's actually a container. It's not an input element here, similar to this. So you still get the value by doing dot value, nevertheless. So you're going to find that and get dot value to get the actual content. You do have to do the closing tag for this because that's a container technically. So think about this more like an exception from the rule, I guess. But other than that, anything that has inner text, you can access that inner text right here, doing text content. And mostly when you're a JavaScript developer, you kind of want to understand what these different tags do in HTML, but at the same time, you want to separate yourself from just thinking about the tags themselves and just understanding that all the tags can be like just container tags with all their attributes and values attached to them. So for example, if I look at this hyperlink right here, see that hyperlink for me, it's similar to having, let's actually add something right here. I'm going to do an H1, so a large piece of text, large text, and then add an attribute ID to this. These two things are going to do completely different things from HTML point of view. So if I go back and reload this, see we have this hyperlink first and large text second. But from syntactical point of view and the way we kind of work with these things in our JavaScript land is going to be the same. So it's still a container. See, it has a opening, a closing, and this one has H1 opening, H1 closing. They both have this text content that appears right here in the middle, and they both have attributes. This one has an attribute href, this one has an attribute ID, and the value for this attribute is this thing right here within this quotations. The value for this attribute is this thing within those quotations. The structure is the same for both of these tags. I did show you, for example, how to change the link, but what if we want to change the text? Because that's the text. See, this is the text that appears inside of that container. So this is the opening and closing of these containers, and that's the text. So that's going to be text content. So if I go back and look for that hyperlink, so I'm going to do document, and I'll just do this method. I think I just have one hyperlink, so that should work in my advantage right now. So that's gonna find this. And if I wanted to change the link, then I do .href, not that, but dot, and then set it to whatever new link I want it to be. So we did this before, something like this. So that should just set it to the new link. So now if we were to click on this, it's going to go to bing.com. But now I also want to change the text. So to change the text of that, it's going to be the text content in the container. So that's going to be a new text content for this. So I'm going to say go to Bing, changes the text for the hyperlink, and it's also a different hyperlink. If I click on this, it goes to a different site. And we deal with these things the same way. So if I wanted to change this large text, I would have to find this H1 with the ID title 2. And then this is the text content of that, because that's the inner part of that element. So just to show you that really quickly here one more time, I'm going to do get element by ID title 2, I believe. And I'm going to do text content, and I'm going to set it to new text. So now that should change this large text that appears here. If I run this, see, it changes it to new text. And that should be plenty of content for this video. We'll probably do some more HTML in the next one. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you soon.